They said the gold was the miracle. They were wrong. The real miracle was the dog who dragged a broken veteran back into a fight he never wanted, and forced a corrupt town to face a truth buried under 40 years of ash. Jacob didn't come to Volcano Rim searching for redemption, but Diesel, he found it for him. They called him a fool the moment he crossed the county line, the veteran who couldn't let go, the man too stubborn to understand that Volcano Rim was a place people left, not returned to. But Jacob Harris kept driving his battered Silverado up the winding road anyway, the engine growling in protest as sleet tapped the hood like impatient fingers. Diesel sat in the passenger seat, steady as stone. 7 years old, retired K9, should have been living a quiet life somewhere flat and predictable. Instead, he rode shotgun beside a man still learning how to breathe outside a war zone. Jacob glanced at him once. Diesel's ears were high. His jaw was locked. His eyes weren't leaving the ridge for a second. The dog sensed something Jacob couldn't yet name. The lodge came into view like a scar stitched into the volcano's rim, a crooked shape leaning towards the ash fields. Jacob's uncle had lived here for decades, alone, until the day he supposedly slipped down a ravine. The sheriff called it an accident. The town never questioned it. Jacob didn't believe either of them. He stepped out of the truck. The air smelled of sulfur and cold stone. Diesel jumped down and froze mid-step, muscles tightening. A low rumble passed through the ground, subtle but undeniable. Jacob steadied himself on the truck door. He'd felt tremors before, but this one carried a different weight, as if the mountain itself was warning him. Diesel growled. Not loud, not aggressive. A soldier's warning, controlled, certain. Jacob scanned the ridge. Nothing but ash and wind. The sun was dipping behind the mountain, throwing jagged shadows across the lodge. The silence that followed was too deliberate, like the land was holding its breath. Inside, the lodge was exactly what the town promised. Abandoned, cold, and heavy with history no one talked about. Dust-covered maps on the wall, a desk with a broken radio, a metal lockbox with the hinges snapped, empty except for a scrap of paper, a set of numbers scribbled in jagged handwriting. Jacob's pulse tightened at the sight. His uncle never did anything carelessly. Diesel padded around the room, nose to the floor. A few seconds later, he stopped dead. Hackles rose, his head tilted towards the far corner where the wood planks were slightly darker, as if scorched long ago. Jacob walked over and ran his hand across the boards. Warm. Too warm. The heater wasn't even connected. The tremor hit harder this time. The walls creaked. A glass jar rattled off a shelf. Dust filled the air. Jacob pulled Diesel close, bracing for more, but the shaking eased just as quickly as it started. He exhaled, but Diesel didn't. The dog was locked onto something outside the window. Jacob followed his gaze and saw a faint glow pulsing through the ash field. Dim, almost imperceptible, like a dying ember refusing to go out. Jacob's throat tightened. No natural light behaved like that. Before he could step closer, Diesel barked once, sharp, urgent, and then he bolted toward the back door. Jacob sprinted after him. The cold slammed into them as they reached the clearing behind the lodge. Diesel skidded to a stop near a shallow depression in the ash. He pawed frantically, sending grey powder flying into the air. Jacob knelt beside him. Under the ash lay metal, burned, warped, reburied by time and tremors. Not debris. A hatch. The kind you didn't build for storage. The kind you built to hide something. Jacob's breath hitched. His uncle never mentioned a hatch. No blueprint showed one. The soil had not been disturbed in years. Whatever was beneath it had been sealed long before the town started whispering about a haunted lodge. Diesel pressed his paw against the steel again, whining low in his throat. Not fear. Recognition. as if some instinct deep inside him had been waiting for this place. Jacob's hand hovered over the cold metal. He felt the mountain humming beneath it. Something buried, something that didn't want to stay that way. He looked at Diesel. The dog met his eyes with the certainty of someone who had walked through fire and knew the world never hid danger without reason. Jacob swallowed hard. This wasn't inheritance. This was invitation. And the mountain was just beginning to open its mouth. By morning the tremors had faded, but the feeling they left behind had not. Jacob stepped onto the porch with a broom in hand and a knot already forming in his chest. The lodge looked different in daylight, less haunted but more wounded, as if it carried the memory of every secret ever buried on the volcano's rim. He spent the first hour clearing debris, checking the beams, opening shutters swollen by years of ash and cold. Every nail, every dent, every burn mark felt intentional. His uncle had been meticulous, a man who repaired everything he touched. But the lodge showed signs of struggle, scratches along the doorframe, a broken lantern under the table, a drawer pulled off its rails as if someone had yanked it open in panic. Jacob ran a hand along the cracked wood. People in town said his uncle slipped on loose rock. But men like his uncle didn't slip. They calculated. They watched their footing. They survived decades alone on a volatile mountain ridge. Nothing here looked accidental. He found a journal buried under a collapsed shelf. Water damaged. Half the pages gone, but one entry remained legible. His uncle had written 4 words in shaky script. "Someone is watching again." Jacob stared at the sentence until his chest tightened. Again meant a history, a pattern, a danger he never shared. Diesel barked outside. Short, urgent, Jacob dropped the journal and rushed out. Behind the lodge, Diesel was tearing into the ash-covered earth with a ferocity Jacob hadn't seen since deployment. His front paws dug in, sending clouds of grey dust swirling in the wind. His focus was absolute, like he had caught the scent of something old and unwilling to stay buried. When Jacob reached him, Diesel stepped back just enough to reveal what he'd uncovered. A jagged piece of metal lay in the shallow pit. Blackened, warped by heat, the size of a thick credit card, but heavier, denser. Jacob lifted it carefully. Even through gloves, it felt strangely warm. He brushed off the ash. Lines and indentations came into view. Not markings, not numbers, circuitry, military-grade circuitry. Jacob recognized the pattern from devices used in reconnaissance work, but this one was different. No serial code, no manufacturer, completely stripped. Diesel whined, nose pressed to the metal as if confirming a memory he could not explain. Jacob crouched beside him. "This wasn't from a hiker," he murmured. "Someone brought tech up here." Diesel's ears twitched toward the ridge. He stood tall, scanning the horizon with sharp, unwavering focus. Jacob followed his gaze. The ash fields stretched into the distance, shimmering under the sun. Nothing moved, but the quiet felt wrong again, like the land was hiding someone just out of sight. Jacob pocketed the metal piece, though every instinct told him not to. The weight of it felt like a question he wasn't ready to answer. As he headed back towards the lodge, Diesel blocked his path. The dog stood firm, body angled towards the tree line, as if urging Jacob to follow. Jacob hesitated. Diesel rarely pushed this hard unless something mattered. "Lead the way," Jacob said. Diesel trotted forward, weaving through fallen branches and hardened patches of volcanic soil. After a few minutes, he stopped at a collapsed section of fence Jacob hadn't noticed before. The posts were snapped, not rotted. The ground showed signs of a struggle, footprints long erased, but still faintly visible beneath layers of ash. Jacob knelt and brushed the surface. 2 sets of prints, one deeper, one dragging, moving toward the ravine where his uncle supposedly fell. His pulse quickened. Someone didn't slip. Someone was pushed or dragged. A cold realization crept into him. His uncle had always been protective, keeping tabs on Jacob even after he joined the military. But why leave this lodge specifically to him? It wasn't inheritance. It was preparation. A handoff. A rustle cut through the silence. Diesel spun instantly, posture sharp. Jacob turned toward the sound, expecting an animal. Instead, he saw a glint deep in the trees. Not metal, a lens catching sunlight. Someone was here, watching. Jacob stepped forward, but the figure vanished before he could call out. Diesel growled low, the sound vibrating through the ground. Jacob felt the old battlefield tension settling back into his bones, the kind that made his heartbeat slow and his senses sharpen. Whoever was in those trees knew the land, and they knew he was here now. Jacob picked up a broken piece of fencing, turning it in his hand. A thin smear of dried blood lined the edge. Old but not ancient. Maybe weeks, maybe days. The tremor the night before, the hatch buried in ash. The metal device Diesel found. Someone on the ridge today. None of it was coincidence. Jacob wasn't just inheriting land. He was stepping into the middle of a story his uncle hadn't finished telling. Diesel pressed himself against Jacob's leg, steady and ready, eyes fixed on the tree line, as if daring whatever lurked there to step closer. Jacob took a slow breath. "All right," he whispered. "We follow the trail, but we do it your way." Diesel moved first, slipping into a silent trot, his instincts guiding them toward answers hidden beneath layers of ash, lies, and time. For the first time since returning to Volcano Rim, Jacob realized something unsettling. His uncle hadn't died protecting the lodge. He died protecting what was buried under it. The second tremor came just after noon. Jacob felt it before he heard it, a hollow vibration rolling through the ground like something enormous shifting beneath the ash. Coffee sloshed over his hand. Dust drifted from the rafters. And outside, Diesel exploded into a bark sharp enough to cut the silence. Another rumble, louder. The floorboards creaked. A lantern swayed on its hook as if nudged by an invisible hand. Jacob bolted out the door. Diesel was already sprinting toward the far side of the ridge, the place where the ground dipped slightly before falling into a steep basin of ash. The dog didn't hesitate. Instinct carried him, paws carving deep tracks through the shifting grey powder. Jacob followed, boots sliding as the ground trembled once more. By the time he reached Diesel, the dog stood rigid over a depression that hadn't been there yesterday. The ash had cracked open, revealing a hollow pocket of earth. Diesel looked at him once, then leapt inside. "Easy," Jacob called, but his voice caught when he saw Diesel emerge with something clamped between his teeth. A metal case, rectangular, burned along one edge. The clasp sealed tight. Diesel carried it up the slope and dropped it at Jacob's feet, tail stiff, gaze locked on the box as if guarding a fallen comrade. Jacob knelt. The case was heavier than it looked. Cold, not with temperature but with history. He pried the latch open. For a second nothing moved. Then the lid groaned upward, exhaling air that smelled like old paper and machine oil. Inside lay a stack of documents, yellowed and brittle, marked with faded government seals. Beneath them, wrapped in cloth, was a single parchment sheet with a hand-drawn map. Thick lines, angles, coordinates, and one label scrawled in block letters. Vault A13. A chill crawled across Jacob's spine. He had heard whispers of such vaults in the military. Strategic, reserves, Cold War contingencies, places where the government hid assets in case the world burned. Most were reclaimed decades ago, but this one, according to his uncle's map, lay somewhere under Volcano Rim. Untouched, forgotten, or deliberately ignored. Jacob sifted through the papers. They described geological surveys, temperature readings, structural tests. His uncle's name appeared multiple times. He wasn't a recluse living in a mountain lodge. He was part of a project, a classified one. Diesel nudged Jacob's elbow, sensing the shift in mood. Jacob lifted a page that seemed more personal than the rest, a torn memo with a handwritten note in the margin. A13 never cleared. Keep watching the ridge. Jacob clenched his jaw. His uncle hadn't been living here out of eccentricity or loneliness. He'd been guarding something, and someone had known it. Diesel stiffened suddenly. His ears shot toward the tree line. Jacob followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing, then a flicker of movement, a shadow slipping behind a cluster of pines. Human height, human speed. The documents scattered as Jacob stood. Diesel positioned himself in front of the case, bracing as if expecting a confrontation. Jacob's pulse climbed. Whoever had been watching them earlier was back, and they knew exactly what Diesel had found. He scooped up the map, shoved it inside his jacket, and lifted the metal case. Diesel circled him, low to the ground, ready. A twig snapped in the distance. Not a tremor, a footstep. Jacob stepped backward toward the lodge, keeping his eyes fixed on the trees. Diesel didn't bark. He simply stared, cold and controlled, the way he had in combat zones when danger hovered just outside sight. The shadow moved again, then vanished entirely. When they reached the relative shelter of the lodge, Jacob closed the door but didn't lock it. A locked door made noise when broken. An unlocked one gave him a few seconds of silence to act first. He set the case on the table and unrolled the map. The coordinates triangulated with predatory precision. The vault lay beneath a lava tube carved decades earlier by heat and pressure. A place accessible only through the unstable ash fields. Jacob exhaled slowly. His uncle must have spent years tracking its location. Years alone. Years keeping the truth hidden. The map wasn't a discovery. It was a responsibility passed on to the one man he trusted. But why trust him with something that could get him killed? Diesel paced the perimeter of the room, nose brushing the floor, tail low. He paused beside a cracked window and stared out with unsettling intensity. Jacob folded the map. "What do you think, buddy? Was this supposed to stay buried?" Diesel turned, walked to Jacob, and placed a paw on the case. A simple gesture, a soldier's answer. "This isn't over." Jacob swallowed the knot in his throat. Diesel had always known what mattered before Jacob did. In Afghanistan, the dog had sensed ambushes seconds before the first shot. Here, on Volcano Rim, he seemed to sense something even deeper. Something old. Something waiting. The tremor earlier hadn't been random. The hatch yesterday wasn't coincidence. The shadow in the trees wasn't a hiker. There was movement on this mountain, and the vault, if truly untouched, was worth more than curiosity could explain. Jacob touched the warm metal piece Diesel found the day before, still in his pocket. A piece of tech near a secret Cold War vault. Someone had been here long after the project ended. He looked at Diesel, who stood in the center of the lodge like a sentinel. "You didn't just find a box today," Jacob whispered. "You opened a door my uncle tried to keep shut." Diesel held his gaze, steady, unblinking. Outside, another small tremor rippled through the ash. The mountain exhaled again, as if confirming what Jacob already knew. Whatever lay beneath Volcano Rim was waking up. And now they had the map. Jacob spent the next day chasing ghosts from his uncle's past. He drove down the mountain with Diesel in the back seat, the metal case hidden beneath the floorboard. The town looked the same as ever, quiet streets and weather-beaten storefronts. But Jacob could feel the shift. People watched him now, not with ridicule, with caution. He parked outside a small veterans' hall built from cinder block and hope. Inside, 3 old men played cards under flickering lights. When Jacob introduced himself, their faces tightened like he had mentioned a curse. They knew his uncle. They remembered him well. But every question Jacob asked was met with a shrug or a forced laugh, until one of them, a thin man with cloudy eyes and lungs worn down by time, laid his cards flat and spoke. "There are things meant to stay buried in the ash," he whispered. "But your uncle kept digging. He found something no one was supposed to find." Jacob leaned in. "Vault A13, did he ever talk about it?" The man's hands trembled. His voice dropped lower. "We all signed papers back then. Projects the government pretended didn't exist. But your uncle, he believed the vault wasn't empty. He said it held more than gold, something worth killing for." Another man slammed his cards down, ending the moment. "That's enough," he said sharply. "Leave it alone, Harris, or the mountain won't be the only thing taking lives." They refused to say more. Jacob walked out with Diesel by his side, the dog's tail stiff, alert to the unease in the air. Back on the mountain road, memories surfaced. His uncle visiting him during deployment, sending care packages without return addresses, disappearing for months at a time. A man living with secrets Jacob thought were harmless quirks. Now he saw them for what they were, warnings in plain sight. At the lodge, Diesel resumed his patrol, pacing the perimeter with military precision. Every few seconds he would lift his head, sniff the air, and reposition himself. Jacob trusted that rhythm more than any security system. Night came fast. A hard wind pushed ash across the ridge, coating the windows in grey. Jacob sat at the table studying the map, tracing the route toward Vault A13 with the tip of his finger. The path ran under the ridge and through a lava tube his uncle had marked with an X and a single word: unstable. Diesel's head snapped up. A low growl vibrated through his chest. Jacob barely had time to stand before Diesel grabbed his sleeve with his teeth and yanked hard, pulling him toward the back door. Jacob staggered, but followed. Diesel didn't act like this unless danger was seconds away. They slipped outside into the cold night. Diesel led him to a narrow outcrop overlooking the lodge. From there, Jacob watched the impossible unfold. A figure approached the lodge, hooded and deliberate. The person carried a canister and a lighter. They slipped inside through the unlocked door Jacob had left open, exactly as the intruder expected. A moment later, an orange flash lit the window. They were burning the documents. Jacob inhaled sharply. Diesel stiffened beside him, ready to charge, but Jacob held him back. The intruder moved with familiarity, not hesitation. Someone who knew the lodge, who knew what to look for, who knew exactly what they wanted destroyed. Jacob's heart hammered. If Diesel hadn't dragged him out minutes earlier, he would have been trapped inside with the fire. The intruder rifled through drawers, checked under the floorboard, and then abruptly froze. Jacob saw it in the angle of their body. They realized the metal case wasn't there. Diesel growled again, this time barely audible but full of meaning. They know. The figure exited the lodge and walked toward the ridge. They paused, scanning the darkness. For one terrifying second, Jacob thought they had spotted him. Diesel pressed against his leg, muscles taut, waiting for a signal to strike. But the stranger finally turned away and disappeared into the trees. Jacob remained frozen until the last sound of footsteps faded. Only then did he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They weren't just being watched. They were being hunted. He crouched beside Diesel and ran a hand along the dog's back. Diesel leaned into the touch, steady and grounded, as if reminding Jacob he wasn't alone in this. In the military, Jacob had relied on Diesel more than any man beside him. Tonight, the bond felt even sharper. Instinct meeting instinct. Back inside, the lodge smelled of smoke. The intruder had tried to burn everything. But Jacob still had the map, the case, the truth his uncle died for. Someone wanted that truth erased. Jacob closed the door gently. "All right, buddy," he whispered. "They made the first move. Now we make the next." Diesel stood in the doorway with the posture of a soldier, eyes locked on the darkness outside, ready for whatever came next. The war Jacob thought he left behind had just followed him home. At first light, Diesel was already at the door, pacing with a focus Jacob recognized from their deployment days. The dog wasn't restless. He was tracking. Something he smelled last night had stayed in his mind, and now it was pulling him forward like a wire drawn tight. "Show me," Jacob said. Diesel trotted ahead, weaving through the ash-coated pines and across a narrow ridge where the volcanic crust was thin enough to radiate warmth through Jacob's boots. The air shimmered faintly, heat rising from vents beneath the earth. Diesel stopped at a jagged crack in the ground, where the ash glowed faintly orange, still warm from the mountain's restless heart. The dog lowered his nose, circled once, then began digging. The ash gave way more easily than Jacob expected. Diesel paused, whined sharply, then stepped aside. Jacob knelt. Beneath the surface lay a metal hatch, old and scorched, its hinges fused by heat and time. It had been hidden deliberately, sealed under layers of volcanic ash. No one would have found it unless they knew where to look, or unless they were guided by instinct sharper than any humans. Jacob brushed off the rest of the ash. A faded emblem appeared on the metal. Not military, not civilian. Something in between. His uncle had marked documents with the same insignia. "Good work, Diesel," he whispered. Diesel stood watch while Jacob forced the hatch open. The hinges groaned in protest, releasing a stale gust of air that smelled of rust, dust, and something older. He lowered himself inside. The chamber was small, swallowed by shadow. As his eyes adjusted, he saw shapes lining the walls. Safes, 6 of them. Heavy, reinforced, fireproof. 3 were wide open, their interiors empty except for scorch marks and scraps of cloth. Someone had beaten him here by years, maybe decades, but one safe near the back remained sealed. Its locking mechanism was intact but old. Jacob tested the wheel. It turned reluctantly, grinding like bone on stone. He worked it until the lock released. Inside lay a collection of documents wrapped in oilcloth. More than that, a small metal container about the size of a cigar box, dented from impact, but still intact. Jacob lifted it gently. Diesel, watching from above, let out a single sharp bark. Jacob opened the lid. Inside was a stack of memos stamped with high-level clearance marks. Most were dull on the surface, discussing the transport and distribution of strategic minerals. But one file stopped Jacob cold. It bore the name of the town's current mayor, Charles Morley, back when he had been a young logistics officer during the final years of the Cold War. The memo detailed unauthorized movement of gold bullion, redirected from a federal vault to off-book locations. One line glared up at Jacob like a spark. Recipient authorized C. Morley, temporary holding until extraction. Jacob sat back on his heels. The mayor, the man who had welcomed him with polite hostility, the man who dismissed his uncle as paranoid, the man whose re-election campaigns were suspiciously well-funded. His uncle hadn't stumbled onto a mystery. He'd uncovered a crime. A faint crunch echoed from above. Jacob froze, his hand on Diesel's collar a second later. Diesel went silent, head angled toward the edge of the hatch. Someone was here. Jacob climbed out slowly, keeping the document tucked under his jacket. Diesel positioned himself between Jacob and the tree line, his body rigid. A figure stepped forward. Sheriff Conrad. Jacob had expected a confrontation, maybe a gun leveled at his chest. Instead, Conrad lifted both hands, palms open. He looked older than he had 2 days ago. More hollow, more human. "You need to walk away, Harris," Conrad said quietly. "You and that dog of yours. This mountain eats men who ask the wrong questions." Jacob didn't move. "You came to burn my lodge down. You tried to destroy my uncle's work." Conrad exhaled. His breath shook. "I did what I was told. But I'm done taking orders from a man who thinks he can rewrite history with a matchstick." Jacob tightened his grip on Diesel's collar. "Morley." Conrad's silence was answer enough. The sheriff scanned the ridge nervously. "You don't understand what you stepped into. Your uncle didn't either, not at first. He thought he could expose the truth without consequences." He paused. He was wrong. Jacob's pulse hammered. "Did you kill him?" Conrad winced. "No. I found him after he fell. I don't know if he was pushed or if the ridge collapsed, but I do know someone wanted him out of the way." Diesel growled low. Conrad nodded at the dog. "That one's smarter than most men I know. If he's leading you somewhere, you should listen. But not here. Not today." Jacob stepped forward. "Then tell me the truth." Conrad's jaw clenched. For a moment, Jacob thought he would pull a weapon. Instead, the sheriff reached into his coat and tossed something onto the ash. A metal tag, burned around the edges. It matched the circuitry piece Diesel had found near the lodge. "This was found in Morley's storage unit," Conrad said. "He's been monitoring activity on the ridge for years. Your arrival changed his timeline. He is getting desperate." Diesel barked once, sharp, urgent. Conrad stiffened. "He has people watching, and they won't hesitate to make you vanish." He stepped backward, retreating into the trees. "I've done bad things, Harris, but I won't have your blood on my hands." Jacob called after him. "Why warn me?" Conrad hesitated only long enough for Diesel to growl again. "Because your uncle saved my life once," Conrad said. "And because dying for Morley's secrets isn't worth the dirt they'll bury you in." He disappeared into the forest before Jacob could speak. Jacob knelt, pressing a hand to Diesel's shoulder. The dog leaned into him, steady and present, a vague reminder of every moment in their past when survival hinged on instinct and trust. Jacob stared at the hatch beneath them, the empty safes, the sealed one now open, the evidence in his jacket, the sheriff's warning. The truth wasn't emerging. It was erupting, and Volcano Rim wasn't done shaking. The mountain never truly slept. Even at dawn, when the sky was pale and soft, the ash fields trembled beneath their feet. Jacob stood outside the lodge with Diesel at his side, scanning the tree line. Something in the air felt wrong, a pressure he could not see but sensed in the tightening of Diesel's posture. The sound came first. Engines. More than one. Diesel growled before Jacob even turned. 3 black SUVs crawled up the ridge road, their tires grinding over pumice and rock. Doors slammed. Figures stepped out. Not law enforcement. Not tourists. These were men who carried themselves with the certainty of people who assumed no one would ever hold them accountable. At the front was Mayor Charles Morley. He smoothed his coat as if preparing for a press conference, not a confrontation. His eyes swept the ridge with proprietary disdain, then settled on Jacob. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble," Morley said. Jacob didn't move. "You should have thought about that before stealing federal assets and burying the truth." Morley smiled thinly. "The truth is whatever survives. Your uncle didn't understand that, and from the looks of it, neither do you." Diesel barked once, sharp and ready. Morley motioned to his men. "Retrieve the evidence, and silence him." Jacob stumbled back as the men advanced. Diesel stepped forward, teeth bared, body angled to shield Jacob from the first attacker. The ground trembled again, dust rising in a thin cloud. One man lunged. Diesel intercepted, slamming into the attacker's arm with precision born from years of service. Jacob dodged another man, catching a blow to the ribs but staying upright. The ridge shook harder. Morley shouted over the rumble, "Careful! This place is unstable." "You came to a volcano to kill me," Jacob snapped. "Unstable is the least of your problems." Diesel launched at the second attacker, knocking him sideways. Jacob took that opening to sprint toward a higher ridge where the ash was shallower. He needed an advantage. Any advantage. Diesel followed at his heels, panting hard. But the third attacker caught up. He swung a metal rod toward Jacob's head. Diesel moved first. He threw himself into the blow. The sound was sickening. A sharp yelp tore the air. Jacob dropped to his knees beside Diesel as the dog staggered, one front leg buckling. Jacob's hands shook as he checked for bleeding. A shallow gash, but the pain in Diesel's eyes told the truth. The impact had done more than cut. A fury Jacob hadn't felt since combat surged through him. He rose, blocking Diesel with his own body. "You touch him again," Jacob said, voice raw, "and you'll find out what a soldier without fear really looks like." Before the attacker could respond, the mountain did. A violent tremor ripped through the ridge. The ground split open with a grinding roar. Ash and rock collapsed into a widening fissure. Men stumbled. Morley shouted orders no one could hear. Jacob grabbed Diesel and pulled him back as the earth in front of them sank, revealing something metallic glinting beneath layers of volcanic debris. Not a vault entrance. A vault itself. Bars of gold, tarnished but unmistakable, lay half-buried in the fractured earth. Crates stamped with federal inventory codes spilled open like relics from another era. The fortune his uncle had died protecting. Morley stared in disbelief. "Get it!" he yelled. "All of it!" Jacob didn't waste the moment. He tapped the camera strapped to his chest. A small light blinked green. He was live. "Mayor Charles Morley," Jacob said with calm fury, "caught attempting to recover stolen federal gold and eliminate witnesses on Volcano Rim." Morley whipped around. "Shut that off!" But Jacob continued broadcasting, turning the camera toward the exposed vault, the crates, the armed men. "This is the proof my uncle found. The proof he died for. You are not taking this from the American people again." Morley lunged, reaching for Jacob's chest. Two men scrambled with him. The signal flickered, distorted by the tremor. "No," Jacob whispered. He adjusted his stance to shield Diesel. "Not yet." The ridge pitched violently. A column of ash erupted nearby. The video transmission stuttered, but long enough. Jacob saw the words on the screen. "Transmitting to FBI field office." Then the feed cut. Morley's scream of rage was lost in another tremor. One of his men slid into the fissure, grabbed a rock edge, then lost his grip. The others stepped back in panic. Jacob lifted Diesel into his arms. The dog was hurt, but conscious, leaning his head into Jacob's shoulder with quiet resilience that tore at Jacob's chest. Morley backed away toward his SUV, shouting for retreat. "This isn't over, Harris." Jacob didn't answer. The mountain did. A final spasm of earth split the ridge further, swallowing 2 crates of gold and blocking the path Morley's men had used to climb up. They fled down the remaining route, their plan collapsing along with the ash. When the dust settled, Jacob stood alone with Diesel, surrounded by the ruins of a secret that had slept under Volcano Rim for decades. He knelt, placing a trembling hand on Diesel's neck. "You saved me again," he whispered. Diesel closed his eyes, breathing steady despite the pain. Jacob gathered him close, staring out across the fractured ridge where gold gleamed between shards of obsidian. The truth was out now, and no amount of ash could bury it again. The mountain was still trembling when the first helicopter appeared over the ridge. Its rotors chopped through the ash-filled air, scattering dust like snow caught in a hard wind. Jacob stood outside the lodge with Diesel resting against his leg, the dog's breathing uneven but steady. Federal agents spilled out of the aircraft before it even touched the ground. 2 more helicopters followed. Then SUVs crawled up the ridge road. The quiet isolation of Volcano Rim vanished in minutes, replaced by radios crackling, boots stomping, and agents shouting coordinates into the wind. An FBI supervisor approached Jacob with the kind of look a man wears when a story is too unbelievable to reject. "You're Harris," the supervisor said. "The transmission came through just before your signal died. We saw everything." Jacob didn't respond at first. He was watching Diesel, who fought to stay upright despite the pain in his shoulder. The veterinarian who arrived with the agents knelt beside the dog immediately, murmuring reassurance as she examined the injury. Diesel didn't flinch. He never did. Another agent approached Jacob. "We have Morley and his men in custody. They were intercepted on the main road trying to flee the county. 2 crates of gold were found in their vehicles, along with forged manifests." Jacob let the information settle. The mayor who had smirked at him just days ago was now handcuffed in the back of a federal truck. Justice never came fast, but when it did, it carried its own kind of thunder. The agent continued. "You won't be charged with anything. You acted in self-defense, and your evidence is critical. We'll need statements, of course, but for now, you did the right thing." The words didn't feel like triumph. They felt like relief. The veterinarian called out softly. "He's lucky. Another inch and the bone would have shattered. He'll need stitches and rest, but he's strong. He's a fighter." Jacob knelt beside Diesel, his hand resting on the dog's head. Diesel closed his eyes briefly, pressing into the touch. The vet wrapped his leg gently. When she finished, Diesel tried to stand again, stubborn to the last breath. Jacob steadied him with both hands. "You don't have to prove anything," Jacob whispered. "You've given enough." Diesel looked up, those dark eyes clear and calm. It was the same look he had given Jacob countless times overseas, when silence said more than command. More agents arrived, setting up floodlights and marking evidence. One approached Jacob with a document in hand. "Mr. Harris, the federal government has verified your uncle's deed and final affidavit. You are the legal heir to the lodge and all properties attached to it. That includes any assets discovered on site that are not classified as federal property." Jacob blinked. "Meaning what exactly?" The agent glanced at the fractured ground where the vault exposed its glittering secrets. "Meaning not all of that gold belonged to the government. Some of it was personal reserve from private contracts your uncle worked on during the original Cold War project. Small in comparison to the federal stores, but legally his, and now yours." Jacob didn't speak. For years he had struggled to understand what he was supposed to do with the life he carried home from war. Now the mountain had given him an answer he never asked for. But wealth wasn't what hit him hardest. It was the knowledge that his uncle had trusted him enough to hide everything here, waiting for him to return, even if Jacob had never planned to. Later, as dusk bled into deep blue, Jacob sat beside Diesel on the lodge steps. The chaos of the day had faded, replaced by muted voices and quiet engines. Ash drifted around them in soft spirals, settling on Diesel's fur like silver dust. Jacob exhaled slowly. "I didn't come back here for gold." Diesel lifted his head. "I came back because something in me was missing," Jacob said. "I thought this place could shake it loose. Instead, it gave me back what the war took." Diesel nudged Jacob's hand with his nose, warm and steady. "You," Jacob said softly. "You're the part I lost." Diesel rested his head on Jacob's thigh. A new scar, thin but visible, ran across his shoulder. It would stay with him, a quiet mark of sacrifice. Jacob stroked the dog's fur, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. Not weak, just healing. The FBI lights cast long shadows across the ridge. Farther down the mountain, Morley was being loaded into a transport vehicle, shouting empty threats that no longer mattered. His empire of lies had collapsed under the weight of truth, and a dog had helped drag it into the light. Jacob didn't look at him. The mountain had its own justice. Jacob had his. The night deepened. The tremors quieted. The air grew still. Diesel shifted, curling closer to him. Jacob whispered into the cooling wind, "We're going to be all right. I'm finally sure of that." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. A year changed the mountain in small, quiet ways. Snow melted a little earlier. The ash fields settled into gentler contours. New pine growth crept across the ridge where the ground had once cracked open. The volcano breathed softer now, as if satisfied that its secrets were no longer buried alone. The lodge changed, too. Where once it had been a forgotten cabin perched on unstable ground, it was now Volcano Rim Lodge and Rehabilitation Center, a place where veterans and retired K9s came to recover, regroup, and reconnect with a world that often moved too fast for wounded hearts. Jacob rebuilt it with the patience of a man who finally understood what he wanted to offer. New beams, reinforced foundations, a wide wraparound porch where visitors sat at dusk and watched the volcanic glow faint beneath the clouds. A training yard for dogs who had served their time. A quiet therapy room for veterans learning to breathe again. And Diesel oversaw it all. Word of what happened on the ridge had spread far beyond the county. Reporters called it the dog who found a forgotten fortune, and the K9 who exposed corruption hidden under volcanic ash. But the veterans who arrived at the lodge told a different story. They said Diesel wasn't just a hero. He was hope in 4 legs and sable fur. Diesel had aged some. The scar on his shoulder had whitened. His muzzle carried flecks of grey. His trot was a little slower, more deliberate. But his eyes were unchanged, sharp, watchful, still carrying the battlefield and the mountain inside them. Every morning he made the same patrol along the porch before sunrise, pausing at the railing to stare out toward the volcano's rim. Jacob often found him there, sitting tall against the wind, as if guarding the place where everything had begun. Jacob would join him with 2 mugs of coffee, one for himself and one Diesel insisted on sniffing even though he never drank it. It was a ritual now, a quiet conversation between 2 souls who had survived more than anyone could see. Visitors often asked Jacob what it felt like, discovering gold that had slept under ash for decades. Jacob always answered the same way. "The gold didn't change my life," he said. "The dog who led me to it did." Sometimes they laughed, thinking it was sentiment, but those who understood combat, or loss, or the enduring loyalty of a dog, nodded with the quiet recognition of truth. On a cool autumn afternoon, Jacob hosted a small gathering at the lodge. Former K9 handlers, veterans from out of state, local families who had followed the investigation into Morley's corruption. They shared food, stories, and the unspoken relief of knowing justice had not only been served, but witnessed. A young veteran named Evan arrived with a shepherd missing part of his ear. The dog had survived an explosion overseas and barely trusted anyone except Evan. But when Diesel approached, the younger dog lowered his head in respect, tail wagging once, cautious but hopeful. Jacob watched the exchange with a soft ache in his chest. "Your boy's something else," Evan said. "He's the only reason any of this exists," Jacob replied. Later that evening, after the guests left and the ridge quieted again, Jacob sat on the porch beside Diesel. The sky glowed red at the horizon, the last light slipping behind the crater. "You think he'd be proud of us?" Jacob asked softly. Diesel didn't move at first. Then he lifted his head and laid it gently on Jacob's knee. Jacob smiled. He understood. His uncle hadn't left the lodge because he expected Jacob to find gold. He left it because he believed Jacob would know what to do with truth, with legacy, with healing. A faint tremor rippled through the ground, more like a heartbeat than a warning. Diesel perked up, ears twitching. Jacob placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right," he whispered. "The mountain's just remembering." Diesel relaxed again, leaning lightly against him. Night settled over Volcano, rim, calm, and steady. Crickets chirped. The wind brushed through the trees like a familiar hand. The lodge lights glowed warm behind them. Jacob glanced down at Diesel. "You gave me back my life," he murmured. "Not the gold, not the justice. You." Diesel blinked slowly, as if acknowledging the words. A moment later he stood, stretched with a soft groan, and resumed his quiet post at the edge of the porch, gaze fixed on the volcanic horizon. Guardian, survivor, soldier. Still watching the place where everything had begun, still choosing to stand beside the man he saved. The morning air over Volcano Rim carried a quiet hum, the kind that settled into the bones rather than the ears. The lodge had seen many visitors over the past year, veterans seeking grounding, handlers seeking closure, families seeking a story worth holding on to. But today's guests were different. A van full of university students pulled up the dirt road, tires crunching over volcanic gravel. They stepped out with backpacks full of notebooks and cameras, their faces lit with the curiosity of people about to touch a piece of history they had only read about. Jacob met them at the porch, Diesel rising from his usual resting spot beside the steps. The dog's joints moved slower now, but his presence carried the same quiet authority as ever. The students froze, smiling instinctively as Diesel approached, sniffed their shoes, and granted them silent approval before settling beside Jacob. Their professor, a soft-spoken woman with silver lining her hair, offered Jacob a firm handshake. "Thank you for letting us visit. Your story has become a cornerstone in our course on modern American folklore and truth-seeking. It's rare to see a legend form in real time." Jacob gave a modest shrug. "I never meant for any of it to be a legend. That's how the real ones start," she said. They gathered on the porch benches, notebooks flipping open as the recorder clicked on. Diesel lay beside Jacob's boot, head resting on his paws, eyes watchful. The questions began simply. Details about the vault's construction, the era of Cold War secrecy, the process of federal retrieval. But soon the students leaned in with deeper questions. What made your uncle choose this location for the vault? What was the mayor's long-term plan with the stolen gold? Did the tremors help expose the chamber, or was it coincidence? Jacob answered patiently, honestly, never exaggerating. The mountain didn't need embellishment. It had already told the truth in its own violent, breathtaking way. Then the smallest student in the group, a boy barely old enough to be in college, raised his hand nervously. "Can I ask one more thing?" he said. Jacob nodded. The boy's eyes flicked to Diesel. "Why him? Why did Diesel find the vault when nobody else ever could?" The porch fell silent, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but waiting. Jacob looked at Diesel for a long moment. The dog lifted his head slightly, those dark, steady eyes reflecting the mountain, the past, the weight of instinct and memory. Jacob finally spoke. "Because he wasn't looking for gold," he said quietly. "He was looking for the truth." The boy nodded slowly, but his expression carried something deeper than curiosity. It held understanding. One of the students whispered, "That's going in the article." Another added, "It should go in the archives." But Jacob wasn't thinking about legacy or records. His gaze stayed on Diesel. Truth. That was what Diesel always sought. On patrol in Afghanistan, he didn't search for threats. He searched for signals, patterns, intent. Something wrong in the air, something buried beneath what humans pretended was normal, and here, on Volcano Rim, he had done the same. The professor leaned forward. Your relationship with Diesel, how would you describe it now, after everything? Jacob exhaled softly. He saved my life more times than I can count, not just physically. When I came back from the war, I wasn't whole. I thought this mountain might break me or rebuild me. Turns out Diesel was the one doing the rebuilding. Diesel nudged Jacob's hand with a warm, familiar weight. One of the students smiled. He's still on duty, isn't he? Jacob nodded. Always. The mountain rumbled faintly in the distance. Not a warning, just a reminder of where they were. The students exchanged nervous glances, but Diesel didn't move. If the dog wasn't worried, none of them needed to be. They spent another hour walking the ridge. Jacob showed them the stabilized section of the vault, now sealed for research. Some students photographed the obsidian fractures, others took soil samples for class projects. When they returned to the lodge, the timid boy lingered behind as the group climbed into the van. He approached Jacob quietly. My brother is a veteran, he said. He doesn't talk about what he went through, but when I told him about Diesel, he listened. He asked me to bring him next time. Jacob placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Bring him. We've got room here. The boy nodded and hurried back to the van, waving as they drove off. Jacob watched them disappear down the ridge road. He sat on the porch again, Diesel leaning heavily against his leg, eyes following the horizon the same way he had the first day they arrived. You know, Jacob murmured, you've done more than find a vault. You gave people something to believe in. Diesel didn't move. He didn't need to. The mountain quieted, the wind softened, and the day settled with a sense of peace Jacob had never known before. Legacy wasn't gold. It was a dog who searched for truth when the world buried it in ash. And found it. Evening draped itself gently over Volcano Rim, painting the ash fields in muted blues and soft golds. The air was cool, touched with the metallic scent of cooling rock. A steady breeze traced the crater's edge like a quiet reminder that the mountain was still alive, even after everything it had given up. Jacob walked along the narrow ridge trail, Diesel pacing beside him. The dog's gait was slower now, thoughtful, each step measured but proud. His scar caught the fading light, a pale mark against sable fur, a reminder of a moment that had nearly taken him, but instead defined him. They reached the overlook where everything had begun, the place where Diesel first sensed what lay beneath the ash, where the ridge shook and the vault awakened after decades of silence. Jacob stopped there, hands in his pockets, breathing in the high-altitude stillness. Diesel sat beside him, lowering himself carefully, joints stiff, but spirit unchanged. His eyes swept the horizon with the same unwavering focus he had shown on patrol years ago. Jacob looked down at him, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the wind or the sun. Funny, he murmured. We came up here looking for answers, and somehow you knew exactly where to start. Diesel rested his head on Jacob's hand, a gesture simple but full of understanding. Jacob ran his fingers along Diesel's fur, slow and deliberate. Money didn't change anything, Jacob said, voice low. But a loyal dog, he changed everything. Diesel didn't bark. He didn't move. He just looked at Jacob with calm, solemn eyes that held more truth than any vault or document ever could. In that gaze, Jacob saw every mile they had walked, every night spent listening for danger, every moment of silent loyalty that had rebuilt him piece by fractured piece. A soft tremor rippled through the ground, almost gentle, like the mountain exhaling. No warning, no threat, just acknowledgement. Jacob chuckled under his breath. Even the volcano agrees. A hawk circled above, wings catching the last light. Diesel followed it with his eyes, ears tilting forward. Despite age, he still noticed everything. Below them, the lodge glowed warmly, lights flickering on as veterans finished dinner and dogs settled into their nighttime routines. Voices drifted faintly through the air, laughter, conversations, the sound of lives healing in ways small and steady. A year ago, Jacob had believed he was coming to the end of something. Instead, he had stepped into the beginning. Diesel had led him there, not with commands or logic, but with instinct, loyalty, and a courage that asked for nothing in return. Jacob knelt, lowering himself so he could meet Diesel's eyes directly. "You know," he said softly, "you're the reason this place exists. You're the reason I'm still standing." Diesel leaned forward, pressing his forehead to Jacob's chest. Jacob closed his eyes, letting the moment settle deep. They stayed like that for a long time, man and dog framed against a cooling crater, the world around them quieting into a gentle hush. Finally, Jacob stood and looked toward the camera he carried on hikes now, the one mounted on a small tripod to record their story for the rehabilitation center's supporters. The red light blinked. "This mountain taught me something," Jacob said, voice soft but steady. "Gold can hide for decades, truth can sleep under ash, but loyalty never buries itself." Diesel sat taller, as if agreeing. Jacob smiled. He wasn't searching for treasure, he was searching for the truth. And sometimes, that truth is just knowing you're not alone. Diesel nudged his hand again, warm and steady. Jacob turned slightly toward the camera, toward everyone watching beyond the ridge and beyond the story. "So now I have a question for you," he said. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" A beat of silence. A breeze, Diesel's tail thumping once against the ground. Jacob added quietly, "And if you believe dogs change lives, support our mission here at Volcano Rim, especially the German shepherds who give us everything they have. Share the story. Help the next veteran find their way home." The sun dipped below the rim, casting the crater in twilight. Diesel stood, leaning lightly against Jacob as they made their way back down the trail. Behind them, the mountain watched in silence. Ahead of them, healing continued.